Welcome to Life with Beth and Court,
where we teach you how to live authentically and build your best life,
one step at a time.
Welcome back to another episode of Life with Beth and Court. I'm Beth.
I'm Court.
And today we're talking about how to set and protect boundaries so you can live your best life.
That was really long. I just wanted to call it #boundaries, and you told me no.
I didn't tell you no. I just said, it seems like you just took the word boundaries and put the word hashtag.
Every time you
the word hashtag.
Every time you say, that's a no. I know
well,
that.
It clearly doesn't stop you most of the time anyway, though.
That's true.
I told you no on that picture. It went up. I told you no on the cover photo. It went up. I told you no on the profile picture. It went up.
Yeah.
So my opinion clearly has very little weight around these parts. All right. So boundaries is a topic that you like to dive deep into. So why don't you start us off, Miss Courtney Kane?
Well, Miss Beth Ann Barbaglia, once upon a time, I did not have boundaries in my life, and I was a people pleaser, and I would do what people wanted me to do, and I would
Is that your fairy tale voice?
Yeah, did you see it? Also with the head tilt and the slight
your eyes are
slant.
squinting, but your voice it's getting softer.
Yeah.
Kind of lovely.
It's fairy tale time.
Oh.
Once upon a time, there was a land where Miss Courtney did not have boundaries. She was a people pleaser, and she said yes to everything because she wanted everyone to like her. She overextended herself, which sounded fun at the time to make everyone else happy, but then she got really, really sad. Cue tears rolling down her face. Her bucket was no longer full. It was spilled all over the floor and very messy and very hard to clean up. And then she was like, what if I just started setting boundaries for myself, and I respectfully started saying no and stopped trying to make everyone else happy? The end.
Does it feel odd to speak in the third person?
No, it's kind of fun.
Okay.
I had imagery the whole time in my brain of all of my fairy tale land. There was lots of glitter, in case you were wondering.
Like soft harp playing.
Yeah.
So let's break this down a little bit, because people may have just heard you say my bucket was spilled and tipping everywhere and been like, why do you have a bucket? So why
everyone doesn't carry a bucket around with them?
Why don't you tell us what your proverbial bucket is?
Sure. So I read a book called Simplify by Bill Hybels, and it talked about how you have to make sure your bucket is full. It's not a real bucket. I mean, if you want to carry a bucket around, you do you, but it's a metaphorical bucket. So you have your bucket, and I'm sure people have heard some form of this analogy before, that like if there's holes in it and you put water in, it can't stay full, or if your bucket's too full, it tips over, or if your bucket's not full enough, you can't help others. There's
lots of buckets.
There's lots of buckets, but the point is you, aren't your best self when your bucket is overflowing or there's holes in it, or whichever analogy you want to use. And when you're not your best self, one, you're not happy. Two, you can't give to others. So even though you're people pleasing and you're saying yes and you're agreeing to all of these things, you're not really happy, which in the end equals, help me out,
bucket tip?
Resentment.
Okay.
So
I was
close.
Going nowhere near there. Yeah. Okay.
It's okay.
Appreciate the help.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did an exercise where we actually physically drew out a bucket. We didn't actually have a bucket like a 5-gallon pail from Home Depot or anything, but we drew a bucket, and inside the bucket we wrote everything down that makes us feel fulfilled, things that make us happy, things that make us feel at peace, things that make us feel like we're coming alive. And then on the outside of that bucket, we wrote down things that drain our bucket, things that make us feel like our energy is zapped, things that irritate us, things that don't make us our best selves. And I think that was it was a helpful exercise for me, because I don't think I'd ever slowed down to identify what I actually do to feel fulfilled.
I agree with you. And when I first did that exercise, I remember I had a really hard time filling my bucket. I drew the bucket on the full-size piece of paper and I wrote down 3 or 4 things, and I couldn't come up with anything more, and that was a really big problem. On the flip side, the things on the outside of my bucket were insane. Those I could think of all day long, and just having that visual for me of, ooh, this is a problem. No wonder I'm having a hard time being fulfilled. I only have 4 or 5 things that fill my bucket. And then I have all of these things on the outside that are irritating me. So that's really when we start having the conversation about boundaries and what can we do to protect ourselves from these things on the outside of our bucket.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that the few things that you could think of to write down inside your bucket, you weren't getting any of that in your life.
Right.
There was, even though you could identify them, you weren't actually getting that time to yourself or getting to have a chance to do those things that actually filled your bucket. So even identifying only 4 of them, you're like, how do I get this in my life? Because right now I'm getting nothing that recharges me.
Right, because I was overextended in a lot of ways. So I was overextended in work was the biggest one. I wasn't setting boundaries on what I was working or how much I was doing or any of those pieces. And then on top of that, all of my friends were like, let's hang out, let's go get drinks, let's do this. And I really needed some time to recharge for myself. But because I didn't know how to do that, because I didn't want people to be upset that I said no, and I didn't know how to communicate that effectively, that was draining the bucket even more. So it was kind of just this cycle of burnout over and over. And it's not that I didn't want to hang out with my friends. That wasn't what it was. But when there was no recharge time for just me, that's where I started to go downhill fast and become resentful and irritated and frustrated because I wasn't setting boundaries around the time I needed for myself to recharge and do what made me happy.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, but some of my favorite people are very, very upfront with their boundaries. And it just feels good because you know that they're not going to agree to, go have coffee with you, but then be like, ugh, when it's time to go have the coffee or cancel on you last minute because they realize that they're totally burned out. Mm-hmm. But some of my favorite people are like, no, man, that time's for me. And you're like, oh, that was very forward. And I appreciate that because now we can actually have a time together that works for both of us. And I don't want to take that time from someone who needs that recharge. And so having the courage to set the boundaries, but then enforce them and be upfront with your friends and family and just say, look, I would love to have a game night with the rest of the family. I just had a really long week at work and I can't extend myself. I just need some recharge time at home. That's going to stop you from being resentful that you go engage and then you're exhausted the next morning and you're like, why do I give all my time to other people? And so being able to identify those boundaries is the first step. Enforcing them communicating them is the second step, and enforcing them is the third step.
Something you said that I think is important to highlight is when you said when they shared that with you, it was really straightforward and you were like, oh, okay. And I think boundaries aren't the norm. And so it's important to know that it might feel weird at first if someone is enforcing their boundaries with you. And again, it's not intended to be hurtful. It's not intended to be malicious. It's just they're communicating their needs and protecting that. And so I think it just takes some getting used to, and that's important to understand, as it might take some time to get used to the communication of you communicating your boundaries and finding what that comfortable space looks like for you. Another thing I think it's important to expand upon that you touched on is the formula for boundaries. So you can set your boundaries all day long. You can communicate them, but unless you're doing the second part of the formula, which is enforcing them, then your boundaries are null and void. I can walk around all day long and say, my boundary is that I need to be in bed by 9:30 p.m. because I value sleep. I can say that, but if I'm out partying all of the time and not following through with what I say my boundaries are, people aren't going to take me seriously.
That was a very outdated example for you.
It was, but that used to be like when I transitioned, I used to be that nighttime person, the party animal. And when I transitioned because my health was suffering, I did have to set a boundary of like, I have to be in bed at this time. That means I'm so happy to hang out with you and thank you for inviting us to this experience, but I will be leaving at 9 p.m. And that was that. So all of that to say, you can talk the talk, but you need to walk the walk or the boundaries are null and void.
Well, and on the talk portion, it's very important that in between setting and enforcing boundaries that you communicate them. Because if you have boundaries that you're not communicating verbally to people, whether that's your significant other, family members, friends, colleagues, if you're not communicating your boundaries, how are they to know?
Yeah.
Right. And so we always say clear as kind from Brene Brown. Let's use that example that you just gave about wanting to be in bed at a certain time and committing or not committing to social events that would get in the way of that. If you went to this party and you didn't say, thank you for the invite, I will be leaving at this time so that I can get home and be in bed at a certain time. If you didn't communicate that, and then you were at this party and this person was like, no, I need you to meet this person, or stay for one more song or whatever, and they kept egging you on to stay and stay and stay. I don't know about you. I get irritated when that happens. I'm like, I'm ready to go. Let me go. But had you communicated to them up front and said, hey, I really want to be here. I'm glad that I'm here. I just want to tell you up front, like, I have to leave by 9 p.m., no exception. So when I say I have to go, I really got to get out of here. That helps set the precedent that this is my priority, this is my boundary. And then if that person continues to cross that boundary, you can say, look, we had this conversation beforehand. This is my priority right now, and I really need to leave. Here's my boundary. I said 9 p.m., and I'm leaving at 9 p.m.
Absolutely. And I think that there can be a fear. Like, if I stand in my truth and I stick to my boundaries, people aren't going to like me. And that's the space I was living in the Once Upon a Time story. I was like, if I tell them no, or I don't come, they're going to be mad at me. And I wouldn't be able to shut off the cycle of this is going to happen and then this, and what that's called is storytelling or fortune telling. So me saying this is what the outcome is going to be. And I would live in that space so heavily that I would never actually consider the other side of it. Like, what if I told them my boundary was I needed to be home by 9 and they said, yeah, we're just happy you're here. Like, we're glad that you came. I kept living in that negative fortune telling space, which never allowed me to do what I needed to do and move forward with it.
Well, and I think what we found is that once we started communicating our boundaries, it actually inspired others to set boundaries for themselves.
Yeah.
And basically, there are people who will say, oh, must be nice when you're like, oh, I'm gonna go home and relax this weekend. Oh, must be nice, because they may have not stuck to their boundaries and committed to a full weekend of doing things for other people that they don't want to be doing. It's not a must be nice. We purposely designed our weekend to be this way. And so if I didn't want to be doing something this weekend, I would not be doing something this weekend. And I think that once you get in the habit of recognizing no one's in charge of my life but me, and no one's in charge of communicating what I want for my life but me, that then, at least for me, it empowered me. So like your example, when you were like, I'm scared that they're not going to like me. I got to the point where once I knew that these are the boundaries I needed to live my best life and feel alive in my daily life, I was like, I don't really care if you don't like me. Yeah. I'm not going to the party this Saturday, or I'm not going to this fundraiser, or, well, most of the fundraisers in our lives are for work, so I have to go to them. But the point is that when you take control of your life and you understand no one's in charge of my life but me, and the bottom line is no one has to live my life but me.
Right.
So if I people please and I go to that party and I commit to this and I commit to this event. So if I commit to all these things that I don't want to actually be doing so that someone else will like me, well, that someone else isn't going to have to live my tired life the next day. Exactly. That someone else isn't going to have to live in my mentally worn down headspace, right? I'm living that. And so I have the power and the choice and the right to defend my boundaries and to say, this is what I want my life to look like. And in order for my life to look like this, these are the boundaries that I'm setting. I'm communicating them with you. And I do not feel one bit bad about enforcing them.
Right. And I think another thing that you said to touch on when you said, that must be nice, right? That passive aggressive comment and it being a choice. Those people either one, haven't realized what boundaries are and that they have the opportunity to make the choice to set their own boundaries and enforce them. Maybe they're stuck in the people-pleasing phase that we talked about earlier. But the other piece of this that you do have to kind of realize when you start to set boundaries, there might be people who generally are jealous or resentful that you choose to live your life that way. And at that point, my expectation is an ownership of conversation. For me, like speaking of boundaries and giving examples, that's a boundary for me. I do not tolerate passive aggressive behavior. And if it happens toward me, I will identify it. I feel like we have to also touch on boundaries don't have to be like this intense, I'm protecting me. Like you are, but there's some compassion and empathy behind it.
Yeah,
so when
course.
you're communicating your boundaries, for the example of passive aggressive behavior, if I'm met with that behavior, I'm going to come at it from a lens of compassion before I communicate my boundary. I'm going to say, when you communicated this way with me, it made me feel really hurt. And I don't like feeling that way. So can we talk this through? After we've had the conversation, then it becomes, just so you know, I don't tolerate passive aggressive behavior. Like if this is an intentional way of speaking to me, I'm not cool with it and I'm not okay with it and I don't respond well to it.
And not all boundary crossing is, meant to be hurtful or is hurtful. I was thinking of an example, a current example for us is on Tuesdays. I have a specific day when when I edit videos.
Ugh.
And you don't like to stay away. So it's really important for me though that I have that time carved out. And I identified that with you and I said, I love spending time with you. However, on Tuesdays from this time to this time, I need to edit one video a week. That's all. And that was pretty hard for you. And it wasn't hurtful to me. It was, I felt bad that I couldn't just hang out with you, but you would come into my office and you would bring your fuzzy blankets and maybe some snacks and just kind of start setting up camp. And that's an example of, we worked through it a couple times where we were like, okay, if we can just protect this time, then we can have time for us afterwards.
Yeah. And so the compromise there was, I don't actually talk to you. I just come into your space and do my own thing. Because for me, our lives are really busy and we do, even when we set intentional time, sometimes that's not enough. And so I am a quality time person. So even being in the same space is really important for me. So we found a compromise through that. And I'm thinking of a time earlier in our relationship where we were going through a rough time and boundaries had to be set and enforced. And I will tell you, it is the hardest thing to enforce boundaries when it's someone you love. I can communicate them all day long and I feel like I do a pretty good job of enforcing them. But when it's someone who's like your heart and you're like, oh God, I have to follow through with this. Like I have to follow through. It's really, really tough to do. But all of that to say, you might have anxiety about communicating boundaries, or it might be really hard because it's someone you love. Those things feel really scary, but as you learn to navigate and when you get to the other side, the return on investment of enforcing those boundaries and being true to you and following through is so powerful and so impactful. And going back to the once upon a time story, so thinking of my bucket, once I started saying no to the things on the outside of my bucket or minimizing my exposure to them. Boundaries doesn't always mean no. Sometimes it means putting yourself in the best situation. And an example of that I'm thinking of is I believe very strongly in treating everyone with equality and respect. And if I feel like that's not being done in a conversation I'm a part of, one, I stand in my truth and I shut it down. Two, I minimize my exposure to that. And so I will stand in my truth and say, I don't really feel comfortable with what you're saying. I think we all are equal. I think we all belong. I think we all have value. So what you're saying feels really derogatory and hurtful, and I'm not okay with it.
Yeah, and you're actually really good at standing in your truth. You stand in your truth stronger than anybody I know, actually.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, that was right from the heart.
I do stand in my truth a lot. And it's not like this negative, nasty. It's just like, hey, man, that's not cool. And I don't want to be a part of this conversation. And I think that's really disrespectful. And then that person, so it's not always saying, this is my boundary. Like you're not always drawing this circle around yourself.
That was like a Megatron voice.
That's what I think of.
Yeah, like Transformers.
Becoming a transformer. Yeah. Like if you cross my
shut down
line in the sand, I become a transformer. And you don't have to verbally say, this is a boundary for me. There are times when that's appropriate. but there are other times where you're saying it without saying it.
So you're really good at setting boundaries, enforcing them, saying it on the spot. But I will say that that is a struggle for me still. I am not as strong in it as you are. So that's something that I always have to be conscious of, that I am standing in my truth so that I don't walk away from any conversation feeling gross. Because
Right.
you know when you didn't stand in your truth. You know when you didn't stand up for someone. You can feel when your boundaries were crossed because you're like, I wish I would have said something at the time. So if someone's struggling and just getting started with trying to identify their boundaries, but then also communicate them and enforce them, what are some tips that you would give them?
So initially, I'm thinking people might be wondering, well, how do I know what my boundaries are? And I think that truthfully goes back to knowing your values and knowing what you believe in. Because if you don't know what your top value is, you don't know where you're operating out of. And we call that our compass. That top value is our compass to everything we do because that's what we believe. So first you have to figure out what you believe and what you don't believe. And another rule of thumb I would say is anything that makes you feel icky, like you just said. And we know when something doesn't feel right. And I think oftentimes we push it down or we ignore it because that's the easy thing to do. And these are really hard conversations, and it is really hard to set boundaries when you're first starting. So one, identifying what your boundaries are and defining those based on your top value. The other thing I would say, so thinking about what you just shared, if I'm a new person, and let's go back to that situation, someone's talking crappy about someone else, and I don't feel like I have the courage in that moment to say something, I can choose to excuse myself from the conversation because then I'm still setting a boundary that I'm not participating in it. When you stand there and you nod your head or you give a verbal expression or even just continuing to be in that environment, you're tolerating it. And so
you're condoning it.
Yeah, if you don't have the courage to in that moment stand in your truth and say, hey man, that's not cool. I don't feel good about talking about someone else. Totally fine. And you can remove yourself from the situation. And to speak to what you said, that you have to remind yourself to stand in your truth because you don't want to walk away feeling icky. I 100% encourage, if you just need to walk away in that moment, but you think about it and you're like, you know what, that really did bother me and I really do need to say something, you can always go back. You can always go back and make it right. So if you feel overwhelmed in that moment and you need a second to find your wording and your footing, give yourself time. And then maybe it's even more appropriate to go up to that person one-on-one later and say, hey man, I just have to say that felt really uncomfortable. And I'm sure your intentions weren't to be hurtful, but it just didn't feel right. And I've got to stand up in my truth a little bit and just say, I'm not okay with that. When you start introducing boundaries with people, you will be so shocked. So this fear I had in the back of my mind, like, oh my God, they're going to think I'm an asshole. The amount of respect that boundaries command is insane.
Yeah, for sure.
If you have the guts to go back to that person who is talking crap about someone and say, hey man, like that didn't sit well with me and I'm not okay with it. Like what's going on? And like bring the compassion in, bring it to the table. Instead of accusing them, say, that's not like you. Like, why is there something more going on? Because then you're opening the door to your displaying behaviors that aren't like you. And if it is someone who's like that all the time, then it is a little bit more of a straight shot. But still, when someone is met with your boundary on the other side, it changes things.
Yeah, people straighten up. They sit up a little taller. And like you said, it commands a lot of respect. And also, like we talked about earlier, it empowers other people around you to do the same thing.
Yeah. Lead by example. You're role modeling. And it's scary. Like when you're first starting to set and enforce boundaries, it feels really scary. And another thing I've noticed that people have shared with us. So recently we had someone who was like, hey, I was supposed to go do this one thing. And then my friend asked me to do this other thing. And I feel like my gut is telling me to do this, but I also don't want to make this person upset. And so she was right on. Like she knew what to do. And it was just a matter of like, you are making a great choice. Like it sounds like you've thought this through. It's just time to enforce it. And so at first she felt guilty. So that's what I'm trying to say is you will feel things. You might feel guilt, you might feel shame, you might feel something. But then once you work through that, she said she felt so confident and good about her decision the rest of the day that she was able to just let it go and feel good. Whereas before she would have cycled and cycled and cycled in that anxiety cycle of what are they going to think? What's going to happen? And so it might feel weird at first and you might feel some guilt, but then if you can stand in your truth and say, no, I really think this was the best decision, or I know it was, you're empowering yourself and you're giving yourself self-confidence, self-assurance, self-respect. Like you are leveling up in so many ways when you stick to the boundary and stand in your truth.
And I think it brings up another good point that it matters who you surround yourself with, right? Because if you don't surround yourself with people who set boundaries, communicate boundaries, and enforce boundaries, when it comes time for you to have someone to bounce it off of and say, hey, I don't know, I feel like in order to be in alignment, I need to stick to this and enforce my boundary. And if you are hanging out with people who don't enforce boundaries, they're like, do whatever feels cooler, like do whatever sounds more fun, or they don't necessarily take the boundary seriously. They may encourage you to go the route that's, like you said earlier, easier, more fun, more convenient, but
or they people please into you.
Right.
And they're like, well, yeah, it's totally fine if you blow them off. Like, whatever. That's totally, like,
right.
They just bleed into whatever you.
And that's not what you need in your life. You need people who are going to help you level up. And so setting boundaries is a great way to start leveling up in your life. Like you mentioned, it starts first with identifying your values. And we actually have an exercise that you can do for free. You can download it over on our website, and we'll put a link in the show notes of how you get the values bracket download. But that helps you identify your very, very top value. And it also walks you through, what does that value look like in your life? How does that show up? Because it's one thing to know, like, my top value is this, but what does that actually mean as far as how I act, how I speak, how I communicate, all of those things? And so this worksheet actually walks you through, once you identify it, what it looks like and what it doesn't look like. And that's as important as knowing what it does look like, because then you know when it's time to say, whoa, this is crossing a boundary for me. This is an alignment for me. And it helps you to live that more authentic life that we're all searching for, that we can walk away from every conversation and lay down at night and be like, yeah, I did my best today.
Boundaries aren't always permanent. So when I hear boundary, my initial thought is like rigid and stiff, and that's okay because there is a time and place for that. But you might have to do temporary boundaries that are helping you get to a growth point. And so I think it's really important to know, like, because when I first started with boundaries, that's how I was. I was like, these are my rules forever. And then as I started to grow and understand people and learn more about myself and things around me, I was like, okay, well, maybe this doesn't have to be a boundary forever because I'm growing and learning through this. So it's important to know that it's not a hard, fast switch. Maybe some are. It depends. It's different for everyone, but they also they can evolve and rotate and shift.
Yeah, for sure.
The other thing you said about the people who cross the boundaries, the repeat offenders, like, so clear is kind, going back to that, my expectations are this up front. And if you have someone who is continuously crossing your boundaries, you don't let it slip. Every time it happens, it's a conversation, and you get to be in control of what that cutoff point is. So if you have the conversation with them, like, hey, this is a boundary for me, and they're like, yeah, man, I totally get it. Not going to happen again. Happens again. Does that mean you cut them out of your life forever? No. I mean, you could, but it would be, you don't just let it slip through the cracks is what I'm saying. It would be like, hey, we talked about that this is really important to me. You said it wasn't going to happen again. I get it. We're all human, but what's going on? So you need to know what the cutoff point is, and it is perfectly okay to cut people and things and situations out if you need to. And I know people probably just went, what? I can cut people out? Sometimes you have to.
Yeah.
And it feels a hell of a lot better to have to cut something out knowing you communicated your boundary every step of the way than not being clear and just one day being pissed off and like, you know what? I'm done with you. Like, I'm done with this. No, if you're cutting someone out or a situation or whatever it may be, and you have communicated every step of the way with your boundary, you can feel 100% good about the decision you make. So to bring that back full circle where we started, when you identify your boundaries, that's the first piece of it, and then start to strengthen them. As I started to strengthen my boundaries, I noticed the things that bothered me before, so the things on the outside of my bucket, didn't have as much power because I took control of it.
Yeah,
and I
for
said,
sure.
these are the things that bother me. I'm going to, one, reduce my exposure to it, two, stand in my truth. And when you do that power switch, they diminish and they start to not be on the outside of your bucket because they're things you just know how to deal with. And then on the other side of that I think is equally as important, is I started to have more energy and time for myself when I started setting those boundaries to recharge and restore and do things that made me happy, not that made other people happy. And once I was in that constant practice of setting those boundaries to protect my time, my bucket started to fill and I started to have more things I enjoyed doing. And the more my bucket filled, the more I actually had genuine, authentic time to give to other people that was intentional, and I was my best self for me, living my best life, and my best self for them. All of that to say, boundaries are super powerful and really important. If you start to implement it little by little, you start to build, I think of like a snowball rolling down a hill, like this courage snowball that grows and expands and grows and expands, and you're just building this momentum. And really, I think it's a foundational tool in living your best life. And I know since I've started living that way, I am so much happier and more fulfilled, and I feel like I'm aligned with who I want to be.
Yeah, and even using you as an example before, when you were completely overextended, your bucket was depleted, you were constantly doing things that drained your energy instead of giving you energy, you were nowhere near as, I say this lovingly, you were nowhere near as compassionate. And you didn't really have, you weren't present when people were talking, and you didn't like to engage in social things, which if anybody knows you now, you're like the queen social bee. But when you're depleted, you didn't have anything to give to anybody else. And so the things that typically brought you joy, you know, like we talk about, the bucket is a living, breathing worksheet there. So before, you wouldn't have written on there that social outings made you happy or filled your bucket.
No,
because
it
they
would have
didn't.
Just been one more thing. And I think when you're depleted because you don't have boundaries and you're overcommitting, overextending, you become resentful. And it's
absolutely.
not intentional. It's just how it is that you can only stack on so many bricks before everything collapses.
And so when you watch, when I watch you enforce those boundaries and slowly, like you said, diminish the things on the outside of the bucket and encourage the things on the inside of the bucket, then you started to come to life as your true self. And I think you're living more authentically now than you ever have before. And I think that's very palpable in your relationships, in your compassion, and you know, what you even desire to do now. You desire to be around people and you desire to engage with people, whereas before you were too exhausted to do those things.
And it shows and people notice. I have had more people in the past year, year and a half, 2 years tell me that I look genuinely happy and healthy. And it's funny because some people are like, what are your secrets? Like, what's different? And really, it's that I started using all of these tips and tools that we talk about and implementing them in micro steps until it just became a part of my lifestyle. And that's what happened. But people notice, like when you are living into your most authentic life and building the you want to be and you're aligned, people take notice and they're like, how are you doing it? Because I want that and I'm happy for you.
And courage is contagious. And like I said, you're one of the most courageous people I know. And so when you continually enforce your boundaries, it seems so simple. And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to try that on too. I'm going to use that phrase next time. So it really is important to surround yourself with people who understand the importance of boundaries. We hope that this conversation today helped you understand the importance of boundaries and where they might fit in your life. And we encourage you, like we said, to go on over to the show notes and grab the freebie. We have a worksheet so that you can identify your top value. And from there, we hope that you will take this bucket exercise we talked about, and it seems really silly, but we literally drew a bucket like we were in first grade. And
I have it
I know you
laminated.
do.
I have a copy at work and a copy at home, and they're laminated.
Yeah, and just so right on the inside of the bucket, things that really give you energy, bring life to you, make you feel recharged. And then on the outside, identify things that don't make you feel like you're coming alive, don't make you feel energized. They drain you, and things that you generally just dread. And we encourage you to start setting boundaries, communicating boundaries, and enforcing boundaries around those things that are on the outside of your bucket so that you can live more fully inside the bucket. As weird as that sounds, I feel like that's a fable. Like, doesn't someone live in a shoe in one?
Mother Hubbard? No, she lived in a cupboard. Someone lived in a shoe with lots of children.
Yeah.
And she didn't know what to do.
Live inside your bucket. So we hope this was helpful for you today. Thanks for hanging out with us for another episode of Life with Bethencourt. We always enjoy our time with you, and we would love to hear what you have to say on this topic, maybe boundaries that you've set and enforced in your life and how that's affected you. So head on over to our website, www.lifewithbethencourt.com. Head to the show notes and comment there, or find us on social media, Facebook or Instagram at Life with Bethencourt, and comment on the podcast post. So until next time, keep building your best life.
Bye, guys.
What are we mic checking with today?
I have nothing. Get it? Do you understand what's about to happen?
I'm not entirely sure, but your eyes say I should.
I don't really need to look very much further. I don't want to have to go where you don't follow. I won't hold it back again. This passion inside can't run from myself. There's nowhere to hide. Do you want me to keep going or just
That's
fast
Whitney.
forward? I know. Do you know the title of the song?
I'm confused what this has to do with boundaries.
I said I have nothing, and I was getting to it, and now I have to fast sing to get to the part I need to. Don't make me close one more door. I don't want to hurt anymore. Stay in my arms if you dare. Must I imagine you there? Don't walk away from me. No, I have nothing, nothing, nothing. I don't know what that was. If I don't have you.
Beautiful.
I have nothing.
That was a fast sing. That was interesting. That was like times 2 tempo.
You don't fast sing when you have to figure out what the missing part is?
No, because I can't remember any lyrics. I don't know how you do it. Where do they all fit in your mind palace?
Well, it probably explains why I can't do math, because all of that was stored up with song lyrics.
I don't know what my excuse is because I can't remember anything, really. Yeah, we actually did a